Hello everybody and welcome to valve adjustment procedure on the Honda VF line. Now, this is going to cover, well, all the V65s and all the VF 700s and all the VF 750s. Now I should note that there are some engine differences at some point. And then this is just a broad video to cover a lot of different machines. There's a lot of bikes. I mean, you got the 82 to 85 Sabre 700 and 750. You have the 83 to 85 or 86 V65 Sabre. Then you have the 82 to 84 Magna 700 and 750. Then you have the 85 to 86 Magna 700 750, like this guy. Then you have the 87 88 Magna 700 and 750. Now we're at 6 bikes now. Then you have the Magna V65. And then you have the 83 to 85 Interceptor VF 700 and 750. And then you also have the VF 1000. That's kind of the same procedure as these. Actually, I should say it is the same procedure as these. So long as your 1000 is of this engine style, that would be the one with the chain-driven cams. That's what you want to look out for. Gear-driven cams, this video is not really going to do you much good. And for those with the 500, you know, the VF 500 Magna or the VF 500 Interceptor, this is going to be an okay reference video for you, but it's not going to entail anything specific. Anything you see in these, it's just not going to be the same, other than the process of adjusting the two adjusters per rocker on each cylinder. That's going to be the only thing that's translatable between each of these. So that's why this is mostly focused on the V65s, but primarily the V45s. So we'll dive into that. Okay, so now we've gotten that all the way. Should mention too that this is not going to cover the VFRs or any Honda V4 post 1988. If your bike was made in the 90s or the thousands, this video is not doing you any bit of good, sorry to say. So, valve adjustment. Okay, what's the deal with valve adjustments? So, on these guys, there are 4 cylinders. There's one here, and then on the other side, this is the chain case area that goes between each of the 2 cylinders. On the other side, you have another cylinder next to each of these guys. So you got 2 cylinders per bank. Then each cylinder has a spark plug right in the middle, and that spark plug is surrounded by 4 valves. 2 on the intake, 2 on the exhaust. The intakes go just like this, exhaust just like that, times 2. Now what actuates the valves are a set of adjustable rockers. When someone says valve adjustment, this is what you're actually adjusting. You'll actually be adjusting the rockers. We'll just move on over to an engine where I can show you. Okay, I have prepared said V4. So let's just remove the valve cover so that you can have full access to everything inside of these guys. So when you remove the valve cover, this is what we're looking at here. And that's what I mentioned earlier. Spark plug, 2 intake valves, 2 exhaust valves. Spark plug, 2 intake valves, 2 exhaust valves. And it's these rockers that you'll be adjusting. You can see, tidy up the camera angle a little bit here. Okay, there we go. So you can see there's a straight slot screw, or we should say slug, that goes in through the rocker, and a locking nut. So it's a 10 millimeter locking nut, and it's a flathead screw that locks against. And then that rocker, it just rides up and down along the tops of the valve and on the bottom side of the cam. So the reason why they're adjustable is because as engines run, the valves, you imagine they move up and down many times a second. They're going up and down a couple times a second. And that's only, say, at idle. As you get up towards the red line, when you're trying to get 10,000 RPMs out of these guys, or more, These guys are traveling many times a second, and what that means is that those valves are beating on their valve seats many times a second. So there is some inevitable wear there as the valves are slamming up against the seats. You can imagine if you were just to hammer any spot of metal with metal, over time one of them is going to mushroom and the other one's going to dent, or they both dent, or they both mushroom, something to that extent. And with these being extremely hot, they get quite soft, so they do it faster. And that means that the valves will slowly creep up into the head. They'll come up at you as you're looking down at them. It's not an overnight thing. It happens extremely slowly over time. And you won't really know until, there's a few ways to tell. But to combat that effect, Honda says you need to be adjusting these every, for us, it's 6,000 miles. 6,000 miles happens to be 10,000 kilometers. So you need to adjust them that often. If you don't put that many miles on, it would be wise to do it every 2 years. We can say something like that, 1 to 3 years. But if you're putting those kind of miles on, just do it at those miles. But the whole deal is that you're supposed to have X amount of gap between those rocker slugs and the valves underneath them. And that gap is necessary because as these warm up while you're riding it, when you start it cold in the garage, it's cold. About 2 to 5 minutes later, these are up to operating temperature. And if you're kind of romping on this, say you're at the track or you're moving between stop signs in rush hour traffic, this thing's up to serious temps. And what that means is whenever metal gets warm, it typically expands. So that expansion, it closes your valve gap. If you don't have that valve gap, what happens is that metal expands. For instance, the valves will expand. And if there's no valve gap, those valves will hang open. If the valves hang open, that means they're not sealing in the combustion chamber, so you're really losing some cylinder compression, which means you're going to have very poor combustion. Ergo, it's going to hot start very poorly. It's going to run when warm very poorly, if at all. So let's go back over to our engine, or our bike, our demonstration piece. Right, and now we're back over. So the question is, well, I don't know when the valve adjustment was last done. How do I know if mine's due or not? Well, there's a few things, okay? Now first, hardly anyone ever does the valve adjustments on these because it looks daunting. I get that. There's 4 cylinders, there's 16 valves, and the cylinders aren't even all in a line. There's 2 up front and there's 2 in the rear. And the ones up front, they're hindered by a radiator to some extent. And then the ones in the back, they're completely covered up by a fuel tank, followed by whatever else is under the fuel tank. Which on these, it's always ignition coils, and then some sort of plastic heat shield. And then depending on the year, you'll actually have metal fuel lines from the pump to the carbs and from the tank to the pump. So there is a bunch of stuff to move. And then there is a fair amount of preparation to it. And a lot of people insist that you need to remove the flywheel cover. Not necessarily. We'll get back to that. And the whole deal with the flywheel cover is, well, you need to be making sure that you're landing perfectly on those marks. No, not necessary. You don't need to be hitting those timing marks on the flywheel. And if you're kind of new to servicing engines, that's only going to complicate things for you, because these are 4-stroke motors, and they do have camshafts. Being these are overhead camshafts, or all the way up here. But regardless, camshafts on 4 strokes usually turn half as fast as the crank. So the crankshaft will turn 2 times before your camshaft turns once. So the issue for newcomers is they'll line up their timing marks for 1 cylinder, and let's just say it's this one, and they have their marks lined up for top dead center of this cylinder. Now the question is, did you land it on top dead center compression, or did you land it on top dead center valve overlap? Because that's the deal. You could turn this and it has a 50% chance of being on compression and 50% chance on being on valve overlap. What valve overlap is, it's the point at which the cam lobe for the exhaust and intake overlap, and it keeps these two valves partially open, ever so slightly open, and that's to help with scavenging. While those two are open, the outgoing exhaust helps suck the intake charge in before the pistons starts coming back down again to draw in more intake charge, with only the piston closing up the exhaust port. So there's a good chance, if you're not familiar with that kind of concept, it may sound simple, but if you're new to these, it's going to seem extremely foreign. You'll end up adjusting these on overlap, and you'll be setting your heights, or your lash heights, should say, and you will either not be able to achieve your proper lash, or you'll get it, and that means when you turn the crankshaft over 360 degrees, so you turn it over completely again, that means you're going to have excessive valve lash on what your actual top dead center compression is. So it's something to keep in mind. But anyhow, as daunting as all that may seem, it's actually incredibly simple. There is some work involved, and there are some tools needed. I have a few extra just so I can kind of show you what you can do here. But in all reality, you just need a couple things. You need, I believe it's a number 6 millimeter Allen, just to do the valve covers. You need a thin wall 18 millimeter spark plug wrench to remove the spark plugs. And then you need some sort of 10 millimeter wrench. It needs to be a closed end wrench so you're not rounding nuts. I like these offset ones that they make for brake calipers. I like these a lot for doing these valve adjustments. And then you need a straight slot screwdriver. It can be kind of thin. You're not using these for any kind of torque. It's just to turn a slug once it's loose. You know, these are for fine maneuvers, so they don't need to be anything hunky. And then you need a feeler gauge set. Sorry. And I will put in the comments all the valve lash specs for each of these Honda V4s, all the applicable ones. I'll put that in the comments for you. It's a Google Drive file that anyone can access at any time, absolutely free, so that you know you're getting the right lash on your machine, because it does vary bike to bike depending on your model and your year and your engine size. But I've went through all of the Honda service manuals and jotted them down. Now, as far as your bike goes, you can actually find these specs printed on a sticker that should be housed right around, it would be somewhere around the frame by your right side foot peg. And this one, it was this decal here that someone's painted over a rattle can. Yeah, you can see it now. But that has all, I shouldn't say all the specifications, but it's got a bunch of specifications. It says how loud your exhaust is at certain RPMs, and it says what to set the valve lash at. And I believe it says something about oil and one other thing that's really not all that important. I think it even mentions ignition timing, even though you can't adjust it. So it might even say ignition timing non-applicable. Anyhow, that sticker will have your valve adjustment information on it. It'll give it to you in standard and metric. So once you have all that handy, here's where you start. Well, and I should say you may need a few additional tools depending on your year and model. For the Magnas, for instance, you do need a 10 millimeter of some sort to get the tank bolts off. And if you have a later one, you're going to need a 12 millimeter to undo that tank bolt. And then you'll also need something to undo the fuel lines if you have an 85, 86, etc., etc. There's way too many bikes to cover every single aspect of all these. But for the the main purpose here, we'll get on the sunny side, is to start by removing the seat. You can leave your battery in, that's perfectly fine. We're actually going to utilize that later to save us some time. Then you remove the fuel tank. So I'll do that. 2 hands, so bear with me. This will be pretty quick and easy. Set it down. Fuel tank's on the floor. Now the bike. You will have to remove the ignition coils on all these V4s. They're going to be in your way. So with most of these, it's 2 or 3 10mm bolts. There's almost always one up front here. On the Magnas and Sabres, it usually helps hold down the airbox assembly here. Mine's already vacant, that helps. One to remove here. I've already loosened it for you. It connects both the ignition coils and grounding straps. And then this one over here, it does the same thing. Here we go. Don't want to lose those. Set those somewhere safe. Okay, now our ignition coils are free to move about the cabin. And they're only connected from the harness on one side. Usually it's the top side. And that's good news, because that means that when we unplug our spark plugs, which we'll have to do, we need to be able to kill ignition for this. And we need to be able to get these valve covers off and around, or at least loose and around. So to do so these spark plug cables need to be removed. Well, that's happened. In the rears of all these, it's going to be much like this. You slowly pull the coils up, and your boots will follow out of some, we'll say well-aligned holes in the heat shield, but that's not what they are. Usually they're turds. But once you do that, you're able to get these boots out through those holes, and then your coils will just flop on over. If it's easier, one thing you can do is loosen up these 2 nuts that secure these plug wires onto the coil. Then you can flip the coils up, like I said, and then just grab your coils from over here, pull them through from the outside of the bike, outside the frame, and now you're good to go. So from here, there's a couple other things you need to do. All these bikes, they're going to have a hydraulic clutch line here. That's what this the thinnest metal line is for those that have it. For other guys, it might just be a couple rubber fuel hoses. But this one being the year it is, 85, it has these hard lines. 86 is like this, and I think maybe even the 87 and 88 700s are like this. Anywho, these will be in your way. You have to move these first. And then once you move these, you can then do the vent lines. Now you can remove your plastic heat shield. When the plastic heat shield is out, we'll show you how to modify that. If you modify it, it'll be easier for future use to remove for valve adjustments in the future. So I'm going to undo the last of the fuel lines here. It's the only one that the previous owner hadn't undone. So we got that all taken care of. One for the tank. It's already been disconnected. So now this, it's kind of a odd arrangement. Fits real neat and tight inside this thing here. But we slide this out, pry it back. We can leave it propped up like this. It's not in the way. Now, the clutch line here, we're going to leave this. We can bend it. Bending it's not illegal. We just can't kink it. That would be seriously problematic. But anyhow, we'll try to loosen up whatever wiring harness there is. On this one, I can tug it some, and it actually I can even pry this little clamp back out from its grommet and get a little bit more rope out of this wiring harness. I can hold it out of the way like this. And then, depending on your bike, the heat shield may come out this way easier, or it may come out that way easier. We'll move on over to a different bike in a minute. But on this 85, 86, I believe it can go either direction. And if you actually remove all these hoses and lines, you can fit these coil mount tabs inside those holes. But usually that's quite a trick to do even on the other years and models. So what we usually try to do is just fight only one side past this, or the other models, the heat shield rides a little higher up, so we can actually force it to one side and sneak our top hooks underneath the frame. So let's go visit a bike that does that. Alrighty, so now we're over here with an 84 or 85 Sabre 700, and you can see that the heat shield is a little bit different, and even the one for the 82 to 84 Magnas are going to be different from even this. But anyhow, you can see that this one is a lot closer to the frame than it is the engine. This one hangs a little higher. So with like the Magna one, you can usually end up kicking this to a side, forcing one of these hooks down, and then you can still manipulate this out one of the two ends. But I believe because of the hydraulic clutch cable, it's best to do that side, force that down, and then force the other side down. Or if the ignition coil is not in the way and your harness isn't in the way, that could come out through the top from this angle. That's on the floor now. We're going to leave it there and report back to our demonstration model. All right. Yep. So you can kind of see how those other ones go, and like I said, it does vary on your machine, both by year and engine size. But what we're going to do with this one is the following. We're going to wrap these plastic hooks. We're actually going to take them up, and we're going to slide. The deal with this one is you have to lift the first hooks over the overlapping frame section on both sides. So I have to do that there. There we go. Now we're able to slide this whole arrangement forward. Now you can see that all of a sudden our ignition coil mounts are lining up with our holes. So now we can force this one up and over. Now that we have it up and over, I'm going to slide it back. Now you keep working the rest of it over, the more blunt bottom end. Once that's around our loom and our frame rails, we can now work on our other side. So our other side, just force it down under the frame. Have to keep manipulating it forward. You can bend these quite a bit. They're extremely forgiving, and they don't get brittle unless they soak in a lot of sun. If your heat shield doesn't have a fuel tank over it, I would be concerned. But in all honesty, these never sustain any serious or long-term damages, I should say. But with this loose, you can see here that the clamps fit right inside this section of frame, and it's really hard to move unless you know those couple tips on getting it out. Now, as far as putting it back in, do you really need these? It would be smart. Any little bit of heat you can keep off of the ignition coils, the better. But there are some tricks to putting these back in easier and make their removal in the future so much easier. Because you'll have to remove this anytime you want to adjust the rear valves, because that's the only way you're going to be able to get to these 4 valve cover bolts. Anyhow, the thing to do is to trim them in just a couple places. You can see that there are 4 J hooks on the top, and then there's these 2 little snappers here. On this year Magna, you can actually leave these. They don't really get in the way. They just help keep it from rattling. On the earlier Magnas, these guys are a lot shorter, and their tang that sticks out here is a lot longer. So the problem with those is because they're shorter, they don't weeble wobble left and right all that good, and the tang sticks out farther, so it really doesn't want to snake out of this hole. So what you do is you trim this tag until it's only about until it's sticking out only about as far as this one. You'll know when you try to put it in. If it's not working for you, trim it a little more. And then for these top J hooks, like I said with this one, you can leave them how they are. but if you wanted to trim them some, you could go right ahead. For the earlier ones, I highly recommend it, because the earlier ones, they come down even further. They actually cover all 180 degrees, versus these guys, they're a little bit less than that. But even still, these ones I'd probably cut right about here. And by doing that, they're still going to sit in their pockets and not move back and forth going down the road. But they're also still going to overhang the one side just a little bit, so that they're not moving left and right down the road either. But doing just that little bit helps you with a lot of clearance. And depending on your year and model, you could be cutting off, like on this one, we could get away with cutting off 3/8 of an inch of plastic on that. That's going to make it much easier to fit in and out of this hole. I guess I can try sharing some photos of these, but I do this to almost every bike I see, unless the customer says to just leave it, because it's going to help. It's going to help whoever does it next, but it's also going to save me a bunch of time when we go to put this back in. So anyhow, that's kind of how the removal and installation of this is. Now we have pretty good access to our rear valve cover. And everything else here, we can leave. It's really not in the way. These couple hoses, they do move. Depending on your model, this is the oil separator vent, PCV vent from the crankcase. It goes into an oil separator, and then from there, there's a hose that goes from the separator up into the airbox plenum. And depending on your model, this can be pretty tight to the valve cover, and you might need to remove it even before you take the plastic heat shield off. But on this one, we were able to remove it without touching these remaining hoses. Some of them will also have this. This is your hose for your coolant overflow tank, for your coolant reservoir expansion tank, however you'd like to call it. So removing that could be real handy too, but depending on the model you have, removing those can be a pain in the rear or be completely unnecessary. Like on this one, we can just leave those here. Now, before we take that valve cover off, we'll focus on the front side here. Now with these fronts, there's a couple things to know. I guess I should have mentioned from the get-go, you don't need to remove the carburetors for any bit of the valve adjustment process. But after the valve adjustment, you do need to synchronize these carburetors. Keep that in mind. Next, so front valve cover, getting to that. Well, it does vary by each of these bikes. The radiator is in the way for pretty much all of these. You can see there's not much for clearance here. But on most of these, you stick an Allen wrench of a certain size, in through one of these slots, and that will actually remove one mounting bolt on this side, and then there's one on the other side, and that'll make the whole bottom of this radiator loose. With the earlier V45s, that's all you need to do. On these later ones, they have a chunk of hose here that makes it pretty restrictive. Even on the earlier ones, if your hoses are pretty stiff, you're not going to get enough movement out of this. So you'll come up here and remove this bolt that pinches the frame, it pinches the radiator around the frame. It's a bolt head on one side and a nut on the other. So it's usually like 8mm head on the bolt and then 10 for the nut. But you remove that, and now you can move your radiator a bunch in all the different directions. But to get even better access out of it, I recommend removing either the bottom hose or the top hose that go into it. If you want to remove the radiator completely, go right ahead. But for all the for most of the other V45s, you'll have to drain the coolant to remove this radiator. But on these 85s and 86s, they actually have a little plastic shutoff valve here, and it's pretty cool. You turn that off. There's a sticker on it that says which way you're turning it and which way does what. But if you set that to off, you can actually undo the screw clamp up here. Try to do the one closest to the valve. Doing this one could make you a mess, but loosen this valve and separate the radiator from this hose. And if that valve isn't leaking and your coolant system is holding its pressure, you will see coolant inside this hose, but it will not pour out. Incredible. Absolutely love that on these. It's so nice. You don't need to dick with any coolant or anything like that. Just loosen all the radiator bolts, remove them so the radiator can swing away. Undo the screw clamp that connects the shutoff valve to this L hose. Shut off that valve, pull the radiator away, and if it's not dripping or making a mess, your system's holding its pressure like it should. It's keeping the necessary vacuum. And hardly anything will come out of this. It'll just be like 3 drops of residual from what the valve couldn't catch. It's just what is underneath the valve, but inside the bung of the valve. Anywho, that's amazing. That gives you full access to this front valve cover. And doing the valve adjustment on that's quite easy. But the rear is where I want to focus our time, because that's where most users or tinkerers have their problems. So I get my my Allen wrench here, I believe size 6. Maybe if I put it in there in the right direction. Here we go. Size 6. Put it in there. Lefty. Oop. Oh, my tool is spinning. Let me grab a different one. Okay, we're back. So I'm going to remove these. And while I do that, I'm going to talk to you guys. Because I fear I may have overlooked it. But there are consequences to not giving these the valve adjustment they need when they need them. Like I said earlier, if you forgo them completely, you know, you're not going to start very good when it's hot, and you're not going to run very good on when it's hot. And if it's bad enough, it's just not going to run at all, you know, because your compression is so poor. The valves are stuck open, or your components wear so much that they just get, your valves don't open far enough. That's like extreme worst case scenario. But anywho, if your bike has over 6,000 miles, just do it. And if your bike has under 6,000 miles, do it. I mean, they're due for a valve adjustment, I believe, in the first 1,500 or 500, something like that. That's when they're due for their first one. Then after that, it's every 6,000 miles. So, you know, so if you can't answer when it was done last, and if your bike has over 6,000 miles, just make it happen. It's not very much time. This video is going to be longer than the process. My first time doing the valve adjustment in these was two hours, because I was trying to learn the best ways of going about it. But after I did that one, all of my other ones have been an hour and a half or less. My quickest one was, I think, 25 minutes, but usually they float around the 45 minute mark, or to hour and 20 minutes. And it mostly comes down to how far out of adjustment are all of the rockers, because like I said, there's 16 rockers. Getting to each of them is a little tricky to start with, but once you have access to one per head, you have access to all of them. But the whole reason why you need to be adjusting them, and I should say that the other way you can tell they need adjusting is if you hear them ticking or tacking, or if you hear any kind of noise from here on up. Do the valve adjustment. That might be your saving grace. But here's what happens. You know, this is a standard valve. This is how a valve ought to look. This is the head. This is the stem. This is the seat face, this angled part here. And then so is this thin line here. That's the mating surface between the valve and the seat. So when you lap this thin strip here, that's what you're going to see as like a kind of dull finish, because you freshly lapped it. It's those two pieces of metal are now grinding against each other, sealing. The problem is when you forgo your valve adjustment, either the valves will hang open, or they'll, because in theory, the valve lash will only shrink. It'll only get smaller, but sometimes it just gets bigger. And that happens when the valve lash is excessive, because when valve lash is excessive, the top of the valve, which is this here, will hammer against the adjuster slug. So we'll just say that this is, you know, our threaded adjuster slug inside our little rocker arm pivot. So that's what that is, our rocker arm pivot. This is the adjustment slug, and it's slightly rounded. So, you know, because it goes up and down up against this straight piece, so it has to be rounded. Otherwise, you're just going to mushroom it horribly. So it's slightly rounded, and the problem is if the gap is excessive, this is actually going to hammer your valve, or I should say your valve is going to hammer this guy. And that results in a lot of mushrooming, and that's going to mushroom your valve here, but it's also going to mushroom your adjuster. And anytime you mushroom metal, you're pushing metal from the inside to the outside. So that metal that was on the inside being on the outside, that means there's less in the middle. So that is making your gap enlarge. Whereas if we're just wearing into the seat, if you imagine this is the seat, this is just shrinking. But should that gap get excessive, you're going to hammer, it's going to enlarge. But even as these sink, you can still end up enlarging these. It comes down to a million different things, how much heat is getting soaked up by the valve, because it's not touching the seat for the seat to absorb properly. You know, there's a lot of different things, but I've seen these just go both ways, and it's never good. But anyhow, should this gap get extremely large, the valve will hammer the adjuster. But you can imagine that, well, what stops the valve if it's not riding against the adjuster? Your valve seat. So your valve seat, this flat face will keep grinding. Because this is going up and down so hard and fast, you're eventually grinding your seat into a rounded face like this, and it's just going to grind your valve into a rounded face. And you'd think, oh, well, now it's sealing even better, and it might be flowing better. That's true, it could be. But the problem we have here is it's usually not sealing better. You know, you can see your valve seat margin here, I should say. You have where the seat and the valve seal. That margin, it's typically not sealing all that great, because by the time you're making this round, you've lost all the hardness between these two components. That means running lean is going to pit these real bad, make them even softer, and then this process just gets extremely out of hand. But with it rounding, you make this part of the valve awfully thin. You know, between the seat face and there's usually a tiny flat spot here that they call the margin, and then the valve head face. You make that spot extremely thin, and what will eventually happen is you'll actually get, you know, due to heat or the effect of it hammering against the seat, these little corners will just bust off, land up in the engine, and oftentimes you won't end up sealing that valve to the seat very well anymore. So it's extremely important to get past that. Because that's not a reliability issue, that's a longevity issue. Reliability issue would be, hey, it's not starting when it's hot, or hey, its performance is really poor once it's hot, or it's not starting at all. Reliability issue would be, I got broken valves, I got broken adjusters, and my cams are crap, and my followers are toast. And there's a lot you can damage. So you imagine while that valve is just getting hammered 10 ways to Sunday, it's doing damage to the rockers, and then that's also doing damage to the cam, and that's also doing damage to the journal. So out of nowhere, you could be ruining the entire head pretty quick, along with almost everything in it but the tensioners and chain. So that's something to definitely keep in mind. But we'll we'll get back to the how-to here. So most of these V4s, they have a splittable rear valve cover. The Interceptors don't, but if you wanted to, you could take the normal V45 valve covers, these splittable ones, put that in the rear of your Interceptor, and now it's actually slightly easier to do the valve adjustment on those. Why Honda never did that, I don't know. I don't need to know. I'm kind of done asking questions of Honda. Now I just answer them for their owners. But anywho, the valve cover, depending on your bikes, a lot of them will only come out the left. Some of them will only come out the right. Then depends on your year. I should say that the 86 to 88 engines look slightly different up top here. The structure is all the same, but the head is cast different, so the valve covers are different, and then the cams are different. But really all that matters is that it'll look different. It's a different shape, and those 86 to 88 valve covers, their top halves are a lot thinner, so they actually sneak out of here better. But you can't just put these on these older engines, the square engines, what I call the trapezoidal heads of the 86 or 88s. They can't be put on these. You'd have to swap the entire heads, and that's extremely doable. That's not a foreign concept, but that's just what you'd have to do. Anyways, so as far as the rear head goes, you take that top half off, and it's up to you if you want to remove this bottom half or not. With the front one, you simply remove it, or you get it so loose that you can swing it to one side, do one cylinder, and then swing it back over, do the other cylinder. But I find these bottom halves are they're just usually too tall for me. So I'll prop them up like this, and like I mentioned for the front, you prop them up on one side. Now you have access to one whole cylinder. When you're ready to do the other, move it to the other side, prop it up, and you have access to the other. Pretty easy stuff. So now we're actually able to go and start doing our valve adjustment. Now before we do this, we should really just yank all the spark plugs and get a compression test out of it. So with the V45s, what you should be seeing for compression is 185 psi plus or minus 28, something like that, and that's the general. It's pretty close to that. I mean, it's like within 2 psi for all the V45s, but that's what it is for the VF700s and the VF750s. Whether you have the Interceptor, the Magna, the Sabre, yada yada yada, practically all the same. But you want to measure compression before and after, because that will actually measure your progress here. Because if your engine might only be showing 160 psi, but after the valve adjustment, we want you to be showing 180, 190. If you have a V65, your initial compression measurements may only show 170-ish, and when you're done, you could be showing 200, 210 psi. That's going to be an extremely noticeable difference in performance. You will feel it. It's going to stand out. 30 psi per cylinder times 4. You're looking at 120 psi. You'd be turning what was a 4-cylinder into a 4.5 cylinder. If you can imagine that. That's a big deal. So now that we're actually ready to bust out the feeler gauges, let's see what we should set them to. Now here is that table that I mentioned, and it's got all the specs for all those bikes that I mentioned. And you can tell that some of them do vary a little bit by year. I overlapped here. I got the V65 Magna written in here. This is supposed to be an S. I'll change that before I share this with everybody. That's supposed to be an S for the Sabre, the 84 to 86 V65 Sabre. Happens to be the same as the V65 Magna. Anyhow, this is your chart, and here's the deal with the Honda stuff, okay? When Honda made these, it seemed that they didn't correctly convert from their metric measurements into standard SAE. And it becomes extremely evident when we look at these guys here. But the problem is if you have SAE feeler gauges and you set it to a normal, say 0.005 inches, but when the book says, do that or do 0.12 millimeters, if you set it to that, you're going to hear actually a lot of ticking, because when you convert this 12, actually comes up as 000 or 0.0047, something like that. Maybe it's 4.5 or 4.3. But anyways, after they converted it to standard, they rounded it up to the nearest 10 thousandths of an inch. So these are all slightly higher than what they should be. Now that doesn't mean when you see the 5 thousandths to just do them at 4. No, that's actually going to be too tight now. It's quite the pain in the butt when you do these with the traditional method. You actually need to establish what I'd call a snug feel. So your traditional feel of 50 thousandths is just going to be too loose. If you make that feeler gauge kind of snug to pull out, you can actually feel some tension on it. Not just drag, but tension on it, you'll achieve proper lash. And what's proper lash? Well, it should be that you hear the most faintest or gentle tick out of most of these. You'll hear it very gentle right at idle, right around 1100 RPMs. But from 2000 on up, it should be absolutely silent. So it's kind of annoying if you actually do the what Honda states for the SAE measurements at traditional feeler gauge feel. It'll tick all the way to red line, something fierce, and they could tack pretty hard at idle. And I say tack as in like ticking, tacking, not no, don't look at your tachometer. Anyhow, but they had other issues, because you can see here that they have, like here, they have 0.12 millimeters marked as 50 thousandths intake on the V45 Interceptor, but on the V30 Interceptor they have 0.12 millimeters again as their valve clearance. But when it comes down to their intake SAE measurement, they rounded it down to 0.004 when it was 0.005. So Honda wasn't even consistent within themselves with this. So don't get too crazy over it. Just do what it says. And measure compression before and after. You don't want, if your compression is showing something crazy ridiculous like 260 psi on any of these, you've definitely done something wrong. Your valves are hanging shut. And if you're getting something incredibly low like 140, your valves are hanging open, or you have other issues like bad head gasket leak, valves not sealing, etc., etc. But yeah, when you're all done, you should be showing really happy compression numbers. Now, there are two ways of going about the valve adjustment. There's a traditional method, and I'll show you what that is here. We'll bust out our feeler gauge, and we'll actually go to what the book says for most of these. It's our 50 thousandths. Slide that off to the side. And then for all these feeler gauges, you'll have to put a slight kink in it so that you can get it inside the head. Proper method is as follows. You set valve adjuster between the adjuster and the valve. In one, you adjust that. You do it in this next one, you adjust that, you move on. There is what they call a Dave Dodge method. And that is where you take an adjuster. He calculated the proper lash measurements. So Yeah, if you Google up his method, it'll state what specific feeler gauges you need for your specific bike to put between actually the cam lobe and the follower. And why it's different is because that's a lot closer to the lobe than these are. There is what they call rocker ratio, and that's the difference. You know, it uses the leverage of the rocker arms to actually increase valve lift. Now, I never do the Dave Dodge method for two reasons. One, everyone says it's faster, and it's very much not. It takes just as much time to do it the Honda way as it does to do the Dave Dodge way. And everyone insists that, well, when you do it the Honda way, you need to use a special tool. When these came out, Honda said, you need to buy our special tool. It's a special little fixture that you insert right here, and it holds the bottom of the cam lobe, and it puts a little sight hole over this adjuster, and it according to Honda, it helps keep the cam in place. Baloney. Unless your cam is shot, you don't need that. By the time you need that, your cam is done, your head is done. You need to be looking for more serious solutions, not a tool to a problem that doesn't exist. But the big issue with the Dave Dodge method is that there's absolutely nothing wrong with it, assuming that your engine's perfectly fine. The problem is you're assuming your engine's perfectly fine, and we all know no one ever adjusts these, so there's oftentimes issues with the rockers. So I drew up two rockers here. One is like new, it's in fantastic shape. You can see it's got on the wear pad here. This is the wear pad. It's nice and round, perfectly round. On this one, you can see it's worn a groove. So this is a little over dramatized, but this could be anywhere from a flat spot to an actual dish that's been ground into that rocker. So with our stock measurements, not a problem whatsoever. We put our feeler gauge underneath the adjuster on both of them, not a single problem. Our adjustment is now set correctly, and it's set for both a brand new one and one that's really worn out. We have very accurate valve lash adjustments on both of those. Dave Dodge method. It assumes that your rocker is in tip-top shape, that you can do this, and you'll have perfect lash. When we tried doing that over here, okay, now we have problems. Can you imagine this feeler gauge trying to conform to this dimple, this divot, this dish that's been cupped into that wear pad that should have been round? It should have been convex, but now it's concave. So now your feeler gauge now needs to smile at you like so. And that's one of two issues. First, it's not going to completely go inside that divot. No matter what, it's just not going to happen. You're not going to fully compress this into that hole without damaging your gauge. But that means two things. You're not going to get a very accurate reading. As you bend metal, or as you measure metal at an angle, it's going to measure a lot thicker this way than it does perpendicularly. So should your rockers be worn at all, doing it the Dave Dodge method, you're going to have extremely excessive valve lash. I've seen some people in the Honda V4 Facebook groups have such issue. They'll do it the Dave Dodge method because they thought it would save them 40 minutes, but all reality, it saved them 5 minutes until they fired it back up and they hear or tick 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 tick. Just because there's excessive lash from idle all the way up to red line. That doesn't go away, it just gets worse the higher you rev it. As you heat it up, it gets slightly better, but it's always still there and dreadfully annoying. So they go back through and they do it the correct way, and funny that, it worked perfect. I followed the instructions and everything. Well, that means that your rockers just are dished. You can see that these ones, they are still round, because this engine only has 10,000 miles under its belt. You can tell by the condition of the cam lobes and the cam journals that this one's just in tip-top shape. absolutely nothing wrong with this guy. But one that's had 30,000 miles, 50,000 miles, or maybe it's only had 13,000 miles and it's been extremely beat on. Had poor oil in it. Someone never changed it, so it ran low a couple times. Has what they call the chocolate cams of 82 and early 83, and the lobe just stayed away at the rocker. Your rocker's no longer routed. It's got a flat spot, or worse, it's actually got a dish to it. Your feeler gauge isn't going to conform to that, so you're not going to get an accurate reading doing that. So don't even bother. You're honestly not saving yourself any time. It takes the same amount of time to adjust one as it does the other. So just do that. But let me show you the technique for doing the valve adjustment. I'm going to remove all my spark plugs real quick, and then we'll get down to the business, and I'll show you the tricks to do it without removing the flywheel cover, because it's not necessary. So hold on. Okay, so we got the plugs out, and presumably this would be the point where you measure your compression per cylinder, then jot them down on a piece of paper. What works great if you draw a straight line, draw another straight line. Now you got 4 quadrants to write your numbers. Just do that, sitting on the bike. This is your line, and this is your other line. So where your left, front right, rear right. You mark each number. Then once you finish your compression test, make another chart of that for your after. Now, the easiest way to do this, actually, don't even bother with that. You'll just make an oily mess. You'll probably need a new gasket, or worse, have to wait for sealer to seal. So you'd have to wait all night for that to cure before you put oil in it, for instance. But what's going to be easiest is by blipping the starter. And you're like, well, isn't that inaccurate? No. On a camshaft, the majority of a camshaft typically is what they call base circles. So that's not where the actual lobe is. You can see this lobe, it's sticking just slightly down, and over here this lobe is sticking slightly out. I'm going to pause, I'll rotate the engine some, and you'll be able to see it again. Okay, so I've turned it some of the way, and here it's actually pretty handy to kind of see where we are. So on most of these cams, there's going to be like an oiling hole on the base, right in the middle of the base circle. So you actually see there, that's kind of where the base circle is. So we'll keep turning the engine around until that's pretty much touching on both of these rockers here. So I'll pause and we'll do that again. Or actually, I'm sorry, I kind of misspoke. I was right though. These oiling holes kind of are almost completely opposite of the nose of the cam lobes. So once you kind of see these pointing at each other, you're good. You can even see that these 2 timing marks here are almost perfectly lined up. Again, to do the valve adjustment, this doesn't need to be critical. And like I said, all you have to do is just turn your kill switch to off, so it's not producing spark and the fuel pump's not running. And then simply blip the starter button until you get these lobes where you want them. And now work on this one cylinder. Start with the 2 intakes, do the 2 exhausts, then repeat, take a step over, do the other head, and then stand up, go around the bike, do the other remaining cylinders. And that's so superior to the Honda way in sadly quite a few regards, because one, like I mentioned, messing with the cover, you're going to lose some oil. Taking that off, you're going to make it a little bit of a mess. You have to clean off the mating surface for it to seal right again. If you need to use gasket maker, it's the same thing. Plus there can't be any oil in this engine, or at least any oil at this point or higher, until like 6 to 12 hours of cure time has been achieved. So then you flop that back on. Sometimes you even need a gasket, so you got to order a gasket. Now you actually have a part into this part-free task. But then also on the flywheel, there's a couple timing marks. They got them just 90 degrees apart, kind of like this. But since we have the piston pretty much at top dead center compression, your marks are going to be like this. Well, I should say they're going to be a little bit more like this, like I first mentioned. Anyhow, there's going to be one for cylinders 1 and 3 and another one for 2 and 4. Maybe I got them flip-flopped. Anywho, you're supposed to line those up with the seam of the top crankcase half and the bottom crankcase half. That's what this little jet out is. So when you remove this cover, you'll see the two halves, and where they meet is a real thin seam. That is how you line up your timing marks. It's a little crude, and it's terribly inaccurate. That's about the biggest problem with these. And Honda says that when you line up those marks, you can then do, for instance, the exhaust of number 3 and the intake of number 4 and the exhaust of number 2, but you can't touch anything on number 3 and or number 1, whatever. But it's just weird because you got to keep track of all of that, and as you rotate the engine, it's going to be really hard to miss all of that. Whereas if you start at one cylinder, do intake, then exhaust, move to the next cylinder on the same side, intake, exhaust, move to the next cylinder of the other side, intake, exhaust, next cylinder, that same side, intake, exhaust. Now you've gone through every single adjuster in time, and you're not running all over the dang bike. That wastes time, and it's hard on the body, and it's extremely easy to overlook any of these guys or manage to do one twice, and now you've definitely messed something up. But you do it this way, it's foolproof. Can't mess it up, can't make a mess, can't ruin parts. Don't need to replace any parts unless like your valve cover gaskets are just toast, or you see some kind of other damage inside your engine. But that's all there is to it. It doesn't need to be any harder than that. And with those timing marks being so far off, it makes it a chore to rebuild these. So that's kind of fun fact to leave you guys with. When you're rebuilding these, take a video of how those lines line up with that crankcase half seam in comparison to the camshaft sprockets, because you can see there's a pair of dots and a pair of lines, and if we look, there's even another set of dots. Front head's the same way, and none of them ever line up on these V4s. I don't know why, but the timing marks up top never line up with the stuff down here. The top ones always seem to be absolutely perfect to each other. The two cam gears always seem perfect to each other, but they never ever seem to match the marks on the flywheel with that seam mark that we've talked about. I don't know why. I don't even know why Honda decided to go with that. So if you just do it the easy way, like I'm trying to describe, you'll bypass all those potential headaches and problematic issues. But that's really all there is to these. If you do what I've mentioned, it's really hard to screw these up. And when you're done, just hold everything back together after you've checked compression to confirm that you've done a decent job. Then when you fire it up, you should hear a nice. That's really, really quiet. So just at idle, and then when you get above 2,000 RPMs, it should be absolutely silent. But yeah, that's how, actually pretty much how it goes with all these early V4s. Like I said, the process for the VFRs and the later V4s, it's comparable. Another note is when you're putting these valve cover bits back on, there is a direction to them. A lot of these will say, I know for sure the fronts on the square ones will say MBO arrow, and then there's an MB2, MB4, and that has an arrow. So these valve covers are directional. You can just barely see it on here, but this forward cutout for the chain is slightly further out than this rear one. That's really the only difference. When you put them on, you'll get what I'll show you. Put them on backwards, and this is the result. You'll have an overbite or an underbite on one side, and overbite on the other. And it'll be interesting because it'll clear absolutely everything on everywhere, except for these two spots, the leading chain case section and then the trailing chain case section. Those two spots will leak oil, guarantee it. So it is pretty important that you get those on straight. I guess not straight, but it's extremely important to make sure you get those oriented correctly. And it's a pain in the butt when you get them off and you put them back on and now they're crooked. Or not crooked, backwards. Not sealing worth a darn, especially on some of these models where you have to fight to put it in. But I get that the video was an hour and some minutes, but in actual practice, you'll blow through it a lot quicker than I did this video. And this was obviously drawn out just so that you could see pros and cons, consequences, and then plenty of tips for you guys so you can help conquer these things. But yeah, that's really all there is to these. It's not as complicated as it may appear. And that's good. That means that you can actually stay on top of these maintenance procedures. It's pretty critical in these, especially in these where it ruins the camshafts, ruins the heads, and now you're out parts. Parts are getting awfully scarce for these now. We're getting to the point where I have to save every single one of these simply just for the transmissions. Luckily, I got plenty of top end stuff, but someday that's all going to disappear, and all my tranny stuff will have been long gone. But anyhow, I'll let you guys be. If there's any questions, feel free to ask them. If you have a suggestion on other maintenance videos, do feel free to suggest those, or any comparison videos. We will have one up for the Magnas versus Sabres real soon, the V45s, and possibly some other stuff as time permits.